This book was written for pastors and Christians who just don't know what to make of dispensationalists. Their interactions with them leave them kind of confused as to what dispensationalists believe. Irwin and Perry write this book not for the dispensationalists, but to help the non-dispensationalists understand what they believe, why they believe it, and then he covers Ezekiel, Daniel, and Revelation in order to help the non-dispensationalist have more confidence when studying those areas of the Bible that dispensationalists find so important and seem so confident walking through. And then he hopes to show the reader why those areas most definitely do not support a dispensational view of the end times. Now, I don't think this book was written at all for dispensationalists, since we don't need an overview of our own systematic. They don't really engage in any current dispensational teachers, and I don't think much of an attempt was made to convince dispensationalists like me of our errors. The only real attempt at that is in part 2, when they talk about what, based on this book, is the great error of dispensationalism, and that is our inability to understand the difference between apocalyptic literature and prophecy. Now, as a dispensationalist, I was really torn by this book. I want to say probably 1,000 good things about it and 1,000 bad things about it. So let's go over what they get right and wrong about dispensationalism. Because while the title reads, After Dispensationalism, dispensationalism is not dead. We are not after it. And us dispensationalists plan on being here all the way until Christ comes back. Welcome to Rev Reads, your home for book reviews from the perspective of a pastor. If you're new to the channel and want to discover more books that will challenge your thinking and push you deeper into the Word of God, please subscribe to the channel in order to stay up to date with the most current reviews. And if you're a regular to the channel, please like this video. It helps a lot. And what helps even more is if you share this video with others. Let them know about the good and the bad in the work of Brian Irwin and Tim Perry. So let's now cover the good in After Dispensationalism. The first chapter was awesome. They walked the reader through the end-timed predictions of the return of Christ throughout the church age, and I loved it. I'd done some of that research myself on church history about 10 years ago, and I learned how time-consuming that work was to find those predictions, but it also had a profound impact on my view of how we are positioned in the church relative to Christ's return, which is, we have no idea when Jesus is coming back. It could be another 10 days, or it legitimately could be another 1,000 years. Those who think we must be in the end times are following the same mistakes of so many before, not just dispensationalists, but also men like Martin Luther, who he thought he was living in the end of days. And that was a great chapter to kick off the book. Another good is the willingness of the author to do his homework. Most critiques on dispensationalism come away in the form of sound bites from authors and pastors who it appears as if they have not done the smallest amount of inquiry to determine what we believe and why we believe it. Irwin clearly took the time to do diligent study in order to understand the eschatology of dispensationalism. And I gotta admit, as someone who hasn't read a lot of Darby myself and a fairly minimal amount of Schofield, only one short book, and I can't remember the last time I looked into a study Bible, I learned some stuff about early dispensationalism. I was kind of shocked at how much they were willing to cover and the care that it seemed like it went into in order to describe dispensationalism. They even talked about Darby's prediction that the Jews would be restored to their promised land in 1840, and how impossible that prediction seemed at the time. And then look what happened about 100 years later. As an example of the mostly even-handedness of their description of dispensationalism, when they got to the section on Armageddon, all they did was simply list and gave the description of that great event from the perspective of Dwight Pentecost. And so they were really trying to be fair in their handling of describing dispensationalism. The only difficulty of their view on dispensationalism, from my perspective, is that it seemed like they hit a pause button on dispensationalism once they reached Armageddon, Oil, and the Middle East Crisis by Walvoord, because there's not really anything outside of some passing references to the Left Behind books that I could notice or remember after the year 1991. Although, one of the great crimes of this book is that they used endnotes instead of footnotes, so I could have missed some of the notes because I wasn't going to the end of the book and checking every one. I hate endnotes. But when you don't engage with current dispensationalists, this makes it seem like dispensationalism is dead when it really isn't. The next good was their willingness to list the positive benefits that have come from dispensationalism. They list, number one, a renewed fervor for evangelism in light of looking to the Lord's return. Second is a zeal for Bible study. And then third was putting an end to the racism of anti-Semitism in the church. It's kind of funny, though, how this book praises dispensationalists for their zeal in evangelism and points out how many missionaries that they have sent throughout the world, but then also they will write about how dispensationalists, especially fundamentalist dispensationalists, will tend toward cultural isolationism, that we won't do things to improve the world that is around us. So are we sending out missionaries, teaching people English, giving them water, or are we just isolating to ourselves? Next, then, when they also talked about how we have a zeal for Bible study, they then describe our Bible study as basically being cutting and pasting verses from unconnected passages together without looking for the context of each passage. And if that's dispensational Bible study, well, it's not praiseworthy at all and should simply be rebuked. Final good in this book is that there's a lot of fine instruction in this book on the importance of looking for the meaning of a passage based on how it would have been understood by the original audience, reading passages in context, placing individual verses and chapters in the entire book. Also, the need for a systematic preaching and teaching through books. That's some genuine quality instruction about how one should study the Bible. And a dispensationalist who is willing to put up with the criticisms in this book, I think can take away and learn some good things about reading the Bible, studying the Bible. And I think it also from time to time can be helpful to have someone who is outside of your group tell you how your group appears to them in order to expose some weaknesses that we might have that we haven't noticed or just kind of brushed under the rug. So I actually thought this book was more helpful than I expected it to be. I even learned some things along the way about dispensationalism, especially early dispensationalism. I think I will be a better dispensationalist because I read after dispensationalism. I think it's going to allow me to be more watchful, to be more guarded against falling into some of the caricatures and poor tendencies of the overall movement. Now let's talk about the bad. The Dusk Jacket said in the beginning that this book is sympathetic to dispensationalism. And then a review on the back by Brian Zahn said that this book is a gentle antidote. In my opinion, this book is neither gentle nor sympathetic. The number of jabs and cuts against dispensationalism will leave any dispensationalist feeling abused and misunderstood by the end of the book. There was this constant refrain that when dispensationalists do Bible study, it must be with a Bible in one hand and then our eyes glued on Fox News TV, going back and forth between the two. Dispensationalists, when they study the word, ignore the context of books and could care less about the original audience it was written to. This was mentioned dozens of times and was the most common and also the most frustrating critique, although there were numerous other slights and jabs throughout. And one of the things that was so difficult about that critique is that I see looking for the author's intent and what a passage would have meant to the original audience as the great strength of dispensationalism. There's a reason that dispensationalists don't use the dry bones of Ezekiel to talk about the gospel, because that's not what that would have meant to Ezekiel's audience. When the minor prophets again and again talk about the Messiah coming, restoring God's kingdom, restoring God's people to their land, and that God himself will rule as the good shepherd among his people, restore the land, we're like, yeah, that's what's going to happen. Jesus is going to come back. He's going to restore his land. He's going to bring his people back together. And we believe that that is what the Jews expected to happen when the Messiah would return. And that's why we believe he's coming back to establish his kingdom still in the future. And there were just these little jabs, though, all throughout the book that just drove me crazy and made me think you would only find this book gentle and sympathetic if you aren't a dispensationalist. If you are a dispensationalist, you're going to come away thinking that Brian Irwin sees you as a terrible student of the scripture and one who is unable to understand the larger messages in a book of the Bible. My next critique goes to the heart of why they label dispensationalism as an error in this book. And that's the designation of Daniel and Revelation primarily as apocalyptic literature, and their view of approaching Daniel as a pseudepigraphal book written during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes and not written by Daniel. And it's kind of ironic to me that they take this apocalyptic view because dispensationalism so often is mocked as being recent, invented in the 1840s. But apocalyptic literature? That genre wasn't even a thing until the 1970s. And that's according to this book. And many of the views of the apocalyptic perspective were unheard of until well into the 20th century. This is not to say that that makes them wrong, but I don't want to hear someone critique dispensationalism as new if they believe Daniel was apocalyptic literature written in the time of the Greeks, because that view comes well after Darby and his teaching. If I had my way, I'd especially take that chapter on apocalyptic literature, that chapter on Daniel, and I'd tear them out of the book, and I think it would be better for it. And then the chapter on Revelation. There was some good stuff in that chapter, which surprised me how much I agreed with the chapter on Revelation after what I just went through in the chapter on Daniel. But I think that was because I'm not sure why they went this angle, but it seemed like the authors were trying to just thread this needle where they would appeal to everyone in the chapter on Revelation. Maybe that wasn't their motive, but that's kind of what it seemed like, because there's nothing in that chapter that tells us what Brian Irwin believed as regards to the controversial portions of the book of Revelation. On the judgments, he just wrote how, the stars will be struck down and we'll have less light in the world. Horses will come up breathing fire. But he never revealed if he believes those things are actually going to happen. He pretty much just parroted what John wrote. And isn't that the eschatological dividing line between dispensationalism and others? The strength of dispensationalism, in my opinion, is that we read Revelation and we take all those judgments at face value. We say something similar to that, something that could fit that image will happen at the end of days. And Irwin seemed to take the same view as dispensationalists because he just never mentions how it will be fulfilled. Allegorically, spiritually, something that already occurred around the time of AD 70. And also, what do these judgments mean to John's first century audience? He explained a lot about how a lot of other things in this book would relate to the original audience, but I don't remember him explaining what they would have thought about those judgments or how they would have related to them. I went back and looked for it a second time, and I couldn't find it anywhere in the book. And then Brian, he doesn't even discuss the use of 1,000 years in John chapter 20 and the release of Satan following those 1,000 years. He never mentions it. He just skips it. He wrote a book titled After Dispensationalism. He covers Revelation in what I think is the longest chapter of the book. He spends 30 pages on the setting for the book of Revelation and the 7 letters that are sent to the 7 churches. And that was all good and fine for the most part. I don't really have major issues with his views on that section outside of the meaning of overcomer. But the reason I don't have issues with all those 30 pages is because they weren't touching on what divides dispensationalists from those who are not. I just taught through those letters over 4 weeks in my church and could have used this book as a resource. And then he comes to the judgments, which dispensationalists take as real judgments in the future before the return of Christ. And all he does is restate what John wrote without stating if he really believes those judgments will come to earth. And then he skips the millennium and Satan's release after it. He just skips it, doesn't mention it. How does that happen? Like, does it not matter to him? Can he not think about what it would mean to those churches who are reading this letter? How would they feel knowing in the midst of their persecution that one day a 1,000-year kingdom will be set up on earth that they can be a part of, and Satan will be chained away during that kingdom? Would they read that and think, nah, John, that's not going to happen? Clearly, this is just symbolically describing the kingdom of Christ, the church age right now while we're suffering in the midst of the persecution. That 1,000 years, it is what we're living in right now. Would that be where they would go with that section? And then if that 1,000 years doesn't happen, does that mean Jesus' return in Revelation 19, that's also symbolic? Jesus really isn't going to come back. It's just a sign that he will be with them in the midst of their suffering. I don't know how he takes it, because he didn't write on the nature of the millennium and the repetition of 1,000 years. And that to me is the biggest flaw of the book. And it's kind of huge. But then the weird thing is, at the same time, this is still most definitely one of the better critiques of dispensationalism overall. If this book was written in 1993, it would have been great, because he would have been engaging with current dispensationalists. It's probably one of the best descriptions of the growth and development of the dispensational view outside of ones that have been written by people who are actually dispensationalists. And I'll say it again. This is a good book for a dispensationalist to read as a warning not to fall into the worst tendencies of the movement. I think this is one of those warnings where you would say, don't be who they say you are, be who you know you should be. Just get ready for some frustration along the way. And I want to end by saying, if you aren't a dispensationalist and you read after dispensationalism, and this view is really your only exposure to this systematic, please read Ryrie's book, Dispensationalism. And even better, read Corey Marsh and James Fazio's Discovering Dispensationalism, since that book is on the development of the view and has several dispensational voices to hear from. I think there's enough good in this book where I need to recommend it. This has got to be a must read, but at the same time, understand it comes with a really large asterisk.